What's good, y'all, and welcome back to another edition of Mr. Fitzgerald's biology class. Today we're kind of wrapping up our unit on energetics by talking about the types of cell respiration. So we've already talked about photosynthesis, we've already talked about cell respiration, we've looked deeper at how cell respiration relates to ATP. Now we're going to dive in and get a little bit more into that cell respiration and talk about the two types of cell respiration overall. Okay, so real quick, a nice review here because again, this is cell respiration that we're looking at, so it does deal with ATP because there's that relationship between the two. So you should remember that ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and that tri is meaning three, so it's an adenosine with three phosphates added to it. That we can break off and actually use the breaking off of those phosphates in order to release energy for the cell to do work. So ATP is that energy currency for the cell to do all of its work that it needs. And how we create it is actually using our food. So we get the energy in from the foods we eat, specifically sugars like glucose and other carbohydrates, but these surplus of other energy sources can be used too. And so we break up that energy from food, and in that process, we use the energy that's released from breaking those sugar molecules or whatever down in order to bind this ADP, to a phosphate group to make it into ATP. So ADP is adenosine diphosphate that gets a phosphate added to become adenosine triphosphate. So two phosphates versus three phosphates. Then this can travel throughout the cell in order to do different cell jobs like transport materials, be used to build proteins or lipids or carbohydrates, whatever it needs to build in the cell, because building things requires energy. Maybe it requires energy to transport the cell itself, or even to just do cell division. So there's a lot of things that ATP can be used for in the cell. So how is it produced and what is it used for? Well, ATP is going to be used for breaking down sugars, it's produced from breaking down sugars like glucose, and it's used for anything that is needed in the cell overall. So transport, division, reproduction, movement, anything that the cell needs to use energy for, ATP is the currency for it. Okay, so what's the formula for cell respiration? You do need to know these, so practice them continuously, knowing what cell respiration's formula and photosynthesis' formulas are. You should hopefully remember now that they're just the reverse of each other, so you just flip-flop the arrow in order to figure out one or the other. So I wouldn't suggest trying to memorize both. Memorize one and just know that the other is the arrow in the opposite direction. So cell respiration, if you choose to memorize this formula, is sometimes written fully out as C6H12O6 for sugar, plus O2 for oxygen, gives us CO2 plus H2O. Okay, so we should know this formula because it's the driving force here. So the byproducts that we're creating are carbon dioxide and water, and we're using sugar and oxygen to get there. And we're also going to release energy during this process. And if you look at this equation, you do see that oxygen is one of the reactants, or one of the main pieces over here. So the question is, can you break down sugar if you don't have oxygen? And that's a question that we will actually answer today. The short of it is yes, but it's a little bit of a different process, and it's something that our cells do in a pinch when we don't have enough oxygen available. So we'll explore that towards the end of this presentation. So there's two types of cell respiration, and it basically is all about whether oxygen is present or not. You have aerobic cell respiration, which requires oxygen. Think about aerobic exercises. You're breathing heavy constantly, so you're using a lot of oxygen during that process. And there's something called anaerobic exercises that use no oxygen during them. It's not that you're necessarily holding your breath. You can make anaerobic by doing that for short periods of time, but we'll talk about the differences between those in just a moment here. So oxygen is either required or oxygen is not required. Now, which do you think would produce more energy if I'm breaking down sugars with oxygen or breaking down sugars without oxygen? Let's kind of explore this real fast. So let's compare them side by side. Okay, and simply put, aerobic, if I'm thinking about aerobic activity, I'm thinking about a person running for a long distance. That could be a couple miles or something like that. So they're usually running at a slower pace overall, and they're breathing continuously through the exercise. Until they get to their finish, they might have to, catch their breath a little bit, but overall, they're usually more upright individuals. Where if I compare that to a sprinter, an individual that's running a short distance as fast as they can, many 100-meter sprinters actually don't even breathe while they run the 100 meters because the oxygen that they're taking in is not going to be used by their muscle tissue right away. So some of them, honestly, they run the race barely even breathing, and they get done with the race and they're usually really trying to suck in some air so that way they can replace that oxygen. So let's look at the two here. So aerobic, again, uses oxygen. This would be most of your normal day-to-day activities. Distance running, walking, just, breathing, sitting there taking notes right now. You're doing aerobic activity. You're breathing in oxygen and you're breaking down sugars with that oxygen in order to get the energy out. Whereas it does produce a lot of energy. So you get about 36 ATP that are produced. In the process of making it, you do consume some ATP. So it's actually about a gain of 36. So it does produce 38, but the gain overall is 36 ATP in this process. That's pretty good. For one molecule of glucose, you get 36 overall in return. That's actually a pretty good return on your investment. Let's look at the anaerobic here. So that's a no oxygen one. This would be like your sprinting, your heavy lifting, your strenuous exercise where you're doing a lot of things in a short amount of time. Okay? And this only actually produces, at the end, 2 ATP molecules. So this is why you can't sprint forever. You don't produce enough energy doing it. You produce much more energy by doing aerobic activities, which is why you need to slow down occasionally and kind of catch your breath, because you need to produce a little bit more energy to be able to do what you need to do. But this one is very quick, short, in a pinch. I need to do something fast. I can use the anaerobic system inside my cells. So let's again look more a little bit at aerobic. So this is where you're breaking down those sugars again with oxygen. Aerobic meaning oxygen. So you get lots of ATP produced. Usually it's about 36 molecules that is gained from this. Okay, so you gain 36 because you spent 2 in the process. We don't have to know how the full process works. Luckily in this class it's kind of complicated, but you do have to spend some to get some. It's kind of like money. You got to spend money to get money sometimes. And aerobic is a great example of that. So overall number is 36. 36 for aerobic. Okay? And it's much more efficient because if I'm running a long distance and I'm producing 36 molecules of energy for every molecule of glucose that I break down, that's a pretty good return. I'm going to be able to continue to go for a long time. And if I train more frequently, my muscle tissues do this more effectively, and I don't get as tired as quickly, which is awesome. But on the other side, there's anaerobic. So this is the no oxygen ones. Another way that we can say this is we can call it fermentation. And there's 2 types of fermentation. There's something called lactic acid fermentation, which is going to occur in our muscle tissues. And this is what we do when we have low oxygen. If we're sprinting or if we're trying to do strenuous work for extended periods of time, we produce lactic acid. We break the sugars down into this lactic acid, and that stores up in our muscle tissues, and it causes us to be very sore. It also makes us very tired. So it is not a good strategy for long periods of time, but it is quick, cheap energy that your cells can use. Okay. Also, we don't just do this for ourselves as animals, like sprinting. Bacteria does this, and this is how we make our cheeses, our yogurts. We use lactobacillus. Lacto, get it? Lactic, lacto. So you're actually using that to produce these cheeses and stuff that are quite delicious. There is something called alcohol fermentation, which is done by yeast. Okay, those are single-celled fungus, and they're actually able to produce those adult-style beverages. So beers, wines, different spirits are made through alcohol fermentation. Some are made differently, depends on what it is, but the kind of general idea is you're producing an alcohol from it as a byproduct. Humans don't do this. We produce lactic acid in low oxygen environments. All right, so real quick review. Which type of respiration provides more ATP? Hopefully you remember that aerobic respiration produces 36 ATP per molecule of glucose, whereas anaerobic only produces 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. So it is much more efficient to use the aerobic side than an anaerobic, okay? Which one uses oxygen? Again, that aerobic is the key thing there. Aerobic kind of refers to oxygen and that gas. So aerobic respiration is using your oxygen as well. What are the 2 types of anaerobic respiration? That again was the lactic acid fermentation and the alcohol fermentation. We as humans undergo the lactic acid fermentation. We break down sugars to produce lactic acid, and it causes our muscles to be sore. Other animals and stuff that do this as well. But alcohol fermentation is done by specific things, and most commonly asked about is yeast. And yeast is a microbe that produces alcohol by breaking down sugars and no oxygen and producing an alcohol byproduct from it. All right. that's all that I have for today with the notes. I am going to kind of show you a little experiment that is going to kind of showcase cell respiration and a lot of things that are asked on test questions that seem really hard because they use big words, but when you see it in action, it's actually a kind of easy concept. So stay tuned in just a little bit and I'm going to show you an experiment. All right, so I wanted to show you a little kind of experiment that's a common reference on a lot of test questions related to cell respiration and photosynthesis. And they talk about placing plants or animals in a solution that contains something called bromoethylene blue. And that's what's in this Erlenmeyer flask here. I got some water with this bromoethylene blue. And what this bromoethylene blue does is it turns yellow in the presence of carbon dioxide. And how that works is because carbon dioxide, when it mixes with water, creates carbonic acid, which is an acidic solution. So this color actually changes from a blue to a yellow when it becomes acidic. And a lot of times we use this to demonstrate how we exhale CO2, or animals or cell respiration in general produces carbon dioxide by having an individual like myself with a straw blow into a flask or a beaker containing bromoethylene blue. So let me show you that color change right now. I got some paper towels here in case it gets messy. I'm gonna try not to get it all over my face. You never know what's gonna happen in a science room, so you gotta be prepared. So here's trying to change this and see how many times it takes me breathing. So we got kind of a greenish color forming here. Clearly I need to exercise more. Now you can start to see it get to more of a yellowish color, and if I keep going I can get it pretty yellow, but I don't feel like blowing out my lungs today, and I'm not wearing safety goggles, so I'm not practicing good lab experiments for you overall. But overall what will happen here is that carbon dioxide is being exhaled by me as a byproduct of cell respiration, and going into this water, it's mixing with the water to produce a carbonic acid, which is turning this indicator to a more yellow solution than it was blue. Now, if I had put a plant in this, for instance, if I take an aquatic plant, put it in here and I seal it off, you should expect over time that the solution will turn back to a bluish color. And the reason that is because photosynthesis will start to happen. The plant will be able to grow based on the CO2 that I exhaled into this, and it'll use that carbon dioxide to produce high quality sugars like glucose that I can use in cell respiration itself. So it'll keep itself sustaining. It won't be able to grow when it starts to take out all the excess CO2 that I put in. But it'll be able to continue to do photosynthesis and cell respiration, so it can produce energy to do its cell processes by basically using its own waste to do so. So if I put a plant in here and I sealed it off, I would expect the plant to survive no problem, and basically a terrarium with a little pH indicator solution, and that solution should turn back blue with a plant in it. If I seal this off now without a plant, it should stay this color all the way through. That's it, and make sure you message me with any questions.